Hello, this is Yvonne Galusha, and I'm here to talk about Chapter 15 with you. First, I want to make some more announcements. Obviously, the quiz is on everyone's mind, so let's talk about that first. It does cover Chapters 12 through 15. 12, remember, we talked about case statements. Then 13, functions and subroutines. 14, date-time concepts. And then today in 15 we're going to talk about variables and variable scope. So I already emailed you some information about the quiz. In general, a third of the points are on concepts, 2/3 on coding. And I would encourage you to review some of the larger assignments just because it's going to be a little more involved coding problem. You will need to diagram a user interface, and also it will include subroutines and possibly functions. So that's my advice to you on that. You may have noticed this, but when you get the homework assignment done, which is also due on Thursday, beginning of class, then you won't have any assignment over spring break. Woohoo! That's going to be nice, right? Right after spring break, I will need to get midterm grades calculated. Chances are I'll even get that done during break. We'll see. But anyway, that when I do that, it's going to include the programming homework assignments, 1 through 5, and then quizzes 1 through 3. It might include this programming assignment 6. I'll just see depending on when Charisse gets it graded. But it will definitely include quizzes 1 through 3. I'll get that graded before I do midterm grade, the last one. And so I won't be dropping the lowest when I do midterm grades. And then we'll throw in that little icon homework assignment as well. So that I have to have deficient grades on the registrar system by Thursday, so that gives you an idea. We'll have that posted for you, so you will see your standing as far as halfway through the course. So in this chapter, remember, it deals with variable scope, and that's something we just haven't been touching upon. It doesn't make a lot of sense until you start developing apps that have variables that are not within a routine. So we're going to talk about that, and then now we're going to talk more about that by value. Somebody noticed that and had emailed me, and I said we'll talk about that later. But you'll hopefully, after you understand these concepts, that'll make more sense. And then we'll go back and talk a little more about the implicit and explicit conversions as well. So to begin with, variable scope is basically talking about the portion of code that a variable can be referenced from. So in general, there's two kinds, local versus global, and we'll learn the specific VB terminology for those two concepts. So the ones that can be referenced throughout the app are generally referred to as global variables, and those that can be referenced only within a particular routine are referred to local variables. That genre is common across programming languages, but I also want you to be familiar with the terms relative to VB specifically. So for a global variable in VB genre, they refer to that as an instance variable. So it's declared the same way that we've been doing with local variables, but it is done outside of a particular routine, but within the class. Typically, it should be at the top, right underneath the class declaration. And then, of course, any procedure within that class can access that variable. So we refer to that as having module level scope. Now, a local variable is declared within this particular procedure, and it has procedure level scope. Now, notice that's not the same as a variable declared just for the use within, like, for example, a for loop, where you declare it right there. I'll talk about that on the next slide. So these have procedure level scope, and they cannot be referenced outside that procedure where they are declared. So those variables that you create just to perhaps control a particular area of code, like a for statement, those are referred to as block scope. And so it just has relevance within that little block of code. Now, where we get a little bit of confusion is, what if you have a variable you declared locally that has the same name as an instance or global variable? Which one is actually being referenced by the code? That's the question. Well, the instance variable is secondary. The local variable by default takes precedence. I try to avoid giving variables the same name, but when you get larger apps, that can happen, and especially if more than one person is writing the app. So just be aware that the local variable is going to take precedence. And if you do want to reference a global within a procedure that has a local variable of the same name, that is when you're going to need to use this notation, me dot. And by that notation, the code realizes you're referencing the global or instance variable. Now, the other part of this is where we get into passing arguments between these routines. You can see why we couldn't talk about these things until you really started coding and understanding the use of subroutines and functions more, because this is the only time they really make sense and apply. Anyway, sending arguments to a procedure by default is pass by value. So what we've been doing when we list the arguments in a call statement, what's happening is the value is being passed to the called procedure. The app literally makes a copy of the argument and puts it in a new memory location, and in essence then refers to that as a local variable for that particular called routine. So you can make changes and it doesn't affect the original calling variable, because it's just the value is being passed and set up as if it's a new variable. Now, if you want the called routine to make changes to the contents of a variable in the calling routine, then you need to do pass by reference. And that's just accomplished by right preceding the variable name, you state by reference. Now, in the functions, you may have noticed when you were putting things in, they also default by value. And so that's where you see that sometimes in the front, automatically put in by the IDE. What happens when you want a called procedure to be able to change the value of more than one argument? Well, that's when you're going to do by reference, because then the contents of the calling procedure variable is going to get updated by any changes within the called procedure. So basically there are these two types of classification of data types in VB. You have a value type is when the variable simply contains the value of that data type, integer. Reference type is when the variable contains the address where the object is stored, hence the name reference. Now I'm going to show you a little diagram at this point to illustrate this. Hopefully the picture will help. I'm not the best artist with my mouse. I think a pencil would have worked better, but hopefully you can read this. So this is just binary here, and it's showing the location of memory. Go for these. And this is the memory slot, is what I intended by these squares. So a value type variable is just going to have, for example, this binary memory location. It has the value of 5. I didn't write it out in binary, but you get the idea. That's the memory location. Obviously the value's in binary as well, but my point is it has this memory location has a value of 5. Whereas, this one, this is memory location is reference type, and what it has, sorry, get this clicking out, is another memory address referencing something else. So in this case, this is a pointer to the string hello. Each letter has its own, sorry, keep clicking. Each letter has its own value. So that's why I kind of showed it as an array. These are different memory locations. Alright, so reference type is a pointer. Value type literally contains the contents. So basically, except for strings, VB's primitive data types like integer, Boolean, decimal, those things we've been using, they are all value type by default classification. Now, the other thing that becomes pertinent then is these conversions. We want to tie back into that. Implicit conversion is when a variable type value is moved into a variable of another data type. We've talked about that before. When this occurs from a smaller to a larger data type, in essence, you're doing an implicit widening. And that's not ever going to cause a problem. That's like moving an integer to a decimal. There's an implicit widening, and that's fine. Sometimes, however, you can get into a problem if you do an implicit narrowing, if you go the other direction from a decimal to an integer, because you could literally lose some information. If it was a floating point number, you would just drop it when you converted by moving the value into an integer instead. So that's why it can lead to logic errors, because of that loss of information. Now, explicit conversion is when you use some sort of coding mechanism to move between data types. So I know I've shown you this one, convert to integer, and I have a similar one, convert to string. So these are VB functions that you call to take, for example, in this case, a string value and convert it to an integer. In this case, converting it to a decimal or a double. Now the .NET class library also has methods that will do this for certain objects. You have, the string, and you do a dot to integer 32. Let me move over and show you something else here. A little too far. There it went. So look what's going on here. We have a count integer type variable, and here we're using the method way to convert to an integer. This is just a text box where the user had entered how many. So you convert dot to integer and store it in the variable integer. I'm sorry, I did say that correctly. It just sounded kind of funny. The variable name is count, which is an integer type. Now these other two are Visual Basic methods. We're using the CINT, and we're converting it to an integer as well. And we've already learned that you can also do a string to a conversion just using val. The issue you have to start thinking about is things like which of these could cause a runtime error, which could cause a compilation error. Now I'll come back to that because I haven't talked about option strict yet, or which could cause a logic error. So we just talked about a situation where you can get logic errors, right? And that is because in this case it's a little different. I'll talk about that here, the logic error first. This last one right here could cause a logic error because val's going to return a 0 if they enter, for example, a letter. And a 0 maybe later on could cause your code to have a problem because you were assuming that they entered something, not 0. So that's something you got to watch for using this one. Similarly, convert to integer. This one, if it's not a number, it's going to give you an error. So that one should be okay.